Hello and welcome to the first child seminar in the academic year 24-25. I'm delighted to welcome you all back here on Zoom for our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Rachel Moquin. She is an Associate Vice Chair for Faculty and Educator Development and an associate professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. I practiced this word so many times today, and it worked.
You nailed it.
It's out. Ah, happy me. Dr. Moquin received her master's degree in curriculum and instruction from the University of Mississippi and her doctoral degree in education leadership and policy from Vanderbilt University. Her background is in education, specifically teaching and learning. She supports professional and faculty development programs across the School of Medicine, as well as supports cultural improvement and has experience in developing educational capacity in others through mentoring and coaching. In her current role, she supports faculty development and faculty affairs and provides development for health professions, educators in teaching practices, curriculum development, integration of learning theory into practice assessment and evaluation, and mentoring practices. Additionally, she supports the program evaluation and educational scholarship efforts of the department and its faculty and educators. Her specific areas of interest include feedback practices, hence today's talk, learning theory, faculty development, belonging, and psychological safety, and qualitative research methods. The talk today is on the distinction between feedback and advice and why it matters. And I'm going to hand over to Rachel.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you all today. It's always a little intimidating presenting to a new audience on Zoom, but the pictures I can see look welcoming and friendly. So I'm going to go ahead and take the awkward few seconds to make sure I have my slides sharing and that I can still see you all. You should be able to see slides.
Yeah. Yes,
okay, perfect.
Slides.
Great. Then I will go ahead and get started. As I am sharing, if you have questions, feel free to jump in, interrupt me, pop things in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that while I'm talking. As mentioned, we're going to talk about feedback and how it is different from advice today. So with that, I will get started. I have two objectives for this talk. The first is that I hope that we are able to define feedback and think about how feedback is different from advice. And then the second objective is thinking about strategies to deliver feedback in a variety of educational contexts. And as you heard in my introduction, I work in health professions, medical education. So that's my lens. So as you hear me talk today, many of my examples will come from that space, clinical learning environments, medical education settings. I've tried to expand some examples so that they're broadly applicable across fields, but did want to caveat that that's the setting that I am working most in when I work with folks on feedback. So you will see those examples today. Helpful to start with a definition of feedback that I will be using when I use the term throughout the talk today. So there are many definitions of feedback. You can find hundreds of them in the literature and in what's been written about feedback, but I like this one, defining feedback as a supportive conversation that clarifies a learner's awareness of their developing competencies, that enhances their self-efficacy for making progress, that challenges them to set objectives for improvement, and facilitates their development that allows that improvement to occur. And I like this definition because you'll see me reference some of the key words from this definition throughout this talk today, particularly focusing in on the concept of awareness and self-efficacy. We'll talk about how feedback is a tool that is intended to support someone's own awareness of their development and empower them to make improvements and to grow. So this is the definition I'll be working from. And then the other helpful starting place, I think, is when you think about the term feedback itself. If you've ever had the experience of presenting into a microphone and then having your voice come out of the speakers and go back into the microphone, and it creates that horrible sounding loop, that's actually a feedback loop. So that's what the term means in that setting. And I think that translates to how I conceptualize a feedback conversation. I like this image for it. Thinking about when we are giving someone feedback, that what we want to be envisioning ourselves doing is holding a mirror up to someone else to say, this is what I notice about your performance or your behavior or the task that you're working on, so that people become aware of their developing competency in whatever area we're giving them feedback on. So throughout this talk, I will reference us being mirror holders up to other people as we think about giving feedback. As you work in education, you probably also experience that there's a lot out there about what makes feedback effective in particular. This comes from the work of Grant Wiggins, The 7 Keys to Effective Feedback. I also like to start by grounding us here and just thinking about as we conceptualize a feedback conversation, remembering that there are some specifics that make feedback more helpful in certain ways. And so the 7 here, you can see feedback that is goal referenced, so that connects to a learner's goals, is impactful. Feedback that is tangible, transparent. And we'll talk about this. That means people know when and how they will be receiving feedback. That's an important component of an effective feedback conversation. That our feedback is actionable. So we are delivering feedback that people can use to enact change or to do something with. If you've ever been given the feedback like, good job, that's not really actionable. It makes us feel good, but I don't really know what to do with feedback that is broad and inactionable like that. Feedback that is user-friendly, so delivered in a way that the learner or the person we're delivering feedback to can understand. And then the last 3 kind of relate to the flow of feedback. We want our feedback to be timely, so close in proximity to the instance that we're giving feedback on. So for example, if someone were to give me feedback about this talk today, it would be really helpful today or tomorrow. It would be less helpful if someone a few months from now were to say, hey, can I give you some feedback on that talk you did a few months ago, right? That would be more difficult because it would be harder for me to remember how the talk had gone. And then feedback is useful when it is ongoing and consistent, so that learners have many opportunities to receive feedback about the same thing. So that consistency, that it's stable, that it comes from a trustworthy source, and that there are lots of opportunities to improve. So those are qualities that no matter how you structure your feedback, help your feedback have a greater impact. So from there, a little bit of like level setting, kind of the terms and concepts. We're going to dive in and talk about how feedback is different from advice. I do a lot of instruction around feedback, and this is where I start because this represents a little bit of a shift, I think, in how we typically naturally deliver feedback. So for example, if you notice a learner who is not speaking up in class, this student then asks to meet with you during your office hours. So you've noticed that they're not really participating in class, they're not answering questions, they're not raising their hand, they're not speaking up. When they meet with you, you might say, you should participate in class more often. You also could say, I notice you aren't speaking up in class very often. Let's talk about that. And the difference between these 2 things is subtle, but the first is actually a piece of advice. And this is where I observe something and then I tell you what you should do about it. I think you should participate in class more often. I notice that you're not. Here's what you should do. The subtle difference in the second is that you're sharing a piece of feedback. You're sharing the observation. I notice you aren't speaking up in class very often. And you're raising that to someone's awareness, which is important. The nuance is slight, but it really matters because in the first, when we give people a piece of advice, we're limiting that opportunity to develop self-awareness. And self-awareness is really, really important when we think about learning and growth. It is correlated with lots of good things: creativity, confidence, relational capacity, our ability to make decisions, our communication skills. The more self-aware we are, the more effective we are, the more impactful we can be. It is also really important in helping our learners develop autonomy, which, as we give people feedback and as they're transitioning into the next stage of whatever phase they're in, we want them to be comfortable acting more and more autonomously, needing less and less of our feedback to do the thing that we're sort of training them or educating them to do. And then it's also important because the more self-aware people are, the more self-efficacy they have. So if I'm aware of my skills, I'm aware of my areas of growth, I become more confident in making decisions, and I believe that I can do things. So that self-awareness to self-efficacy piece is really important. So the first reason that I try to switch from advice giving to objective mirror holding feedback is because I want to be raising self-awareness of learners. Other ways that impact of advice manifests in learners is when learners or when people get conditioned to hear and expect advice in a setting, right? If they're usually told what to do, it can become really confusing and overwhelming when one instructor tells them one piece of advice and someone else tells them a conflicting piece of advice, right? When there's too many opinions, there's too much advice, it can lead to this sort of indecision, right? I don't really know whose advice to listen to. I haven't learned how to make that judgment for myself. And it can also lead to problems when all of a sudden there is no one giving advice anymore. So if people are used to being told, hey, I think you should do it this way, try this, all of a sudden, if you remove that, people haven't developed the autonomy on their own to make decisions. So it leads to sort of panic, anxiety, and inaction if people become sort of dependent on advice. So that's one of the ways that advice giving rather than feedback can have an impact. The other is thinking about this concept of this is the ladder of inference. And so what this model suggests is that our brains have lots of shortcuts in them to help us make decisions. Particularly when I'm working with folks in the clinical or medical education environments, people need to make decisions very quickly. And the ladder of inference helps us do that. So there's all this observable data that we see, and we select what stands out to us from all of the potential observations we make. And we pull pieces out and we begin to add meaning, make assumptions, draw conclusions. And then those conclusions translate into action. So an example of this, I think, is helpful. If I'm working with a collaborator on, say, an important grant submission, and this person has missed an important deadline, all of a sudden we had something due for the grant, it was really important, and they missed it, and they've not responded to my emails in the last few days. That's some observable data. I start to feel frustrated, so I send a text message, or maybe I make a phone call, and that also goes unanswered. Then I start to make assumptions and add meaning, right? I begin to think, okay, this person doesn't care about the project. They're prioritizing other work. This is me adding assumptions based on what I perceive about the situation. I decide then that they are an unreliable collaborator and I remove them from the project. So I've walked myself all the way up the ladder of inference. I've pulled out some observations. I have felt frustrated. I've added meaning. I'm drawing conclusions, and those conclusions lead me to action. The tricky thing about this is that once we start to walk up the ladder of inference, we're at risk of this phenomenon called confirmation bias. Because once I've added assumptions and meaning, I begin to pay more attention to data that confirms my assumptions. So as I'm feeling frustrated about this collaborator, I might start asking around, hey, has this person been answering your emails lately? Have you worked with them before? What was your experience? And we begin to pay more attention to the data that confirms our story. So I might have 3 people say, no, they've always been really responsive to me. And I might have one person respond, yeah, I'm waiting on a couple emails from them too. I'm really frustrated. And that story gets more weight in our minds than the others because it confirms what we think. And so when we start with a piece of advice, we're moving pretty quickly up the ladder of inference. And I'll show you an example of how this impacts our feedback. So observations as the initiation of a feedback conversation help us lead to understanding, and they stop us from working up the ladder of inference. For example, if you were giving feedback to someone, you might say, I noticed you've chosen X approach. Why? So that's an observation. I noticed that they're doing something a certain way, and I want to talk about it. And if you ask them why, after sharing the observation, you could hear a couple things. You might hear, well, Dr. Smith showed me this method and I wanted to try it. Or you might hear, well, this usually works best for me. Or I don't know another way. And if you stop at the observation and give a learner an opportunity to add the context instead of making an inference, you can see how, as an educator, then you would treat these responses differently, right? The first indicates that they're trying something new. And if it's not going well, you have now the insight that this is the first time they've ever tried it. And so you'll support them in whatever way it seems appropriate. The second answer, this usually works best for me, means that they've tried this before. And so you would treat that situation a little bit differently. And then the third answer, I don't know another way, paves an opportunity for some teaching, some advice giving. Well, can I show you the way I approach it? Can I model this technique for you? Right? But as an educator, each of those conversations then goes on a different direction. The next example there, I can't hear you when you talk in the OR, the operating room. Do you notice that? What's going on? You might hear from a learner, that surgeon makes me feel nervous, I think. Or, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing. Or, no, I didn't notice. What do you recommend? And again, you would work with this learner differently based on the feedback that you provide and what you learn about the context. So in the first instance, we would work through team dynamics. Why is that surgeon making you feel nervous? How can we mitigate that so that you feel more confident? The second, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing. Oh, well, let's walk through the procedure. Let me talk to you about your role. And the last, I didn't notice. What do you recommend? Okay, maybe we work on projecting your voice, right? But again, totally different educational outcomes based on the observation that you share. And then the last, this I pulled from my own household. Hey, the dishwasher hasn't been started. What's up? You might observe that. And you might hear back, well, I wanted to wait till after dinner to put the plates in. You also might hear, I forgot. Okay, great. Can you do it? And the last, I don't know how our dishwasher works. Again, depending on what you get back, you move forward in the feedback interaction differently. A couple of tools that I think help our instinct as educators is to go for advice. We want to help people. We want to support people. We want to share our knowledge, our expertise, right? We don't want to see people struggle. It's in our nature. And so that tends to have us jump straight to, let me help you. Here's what I think you should do. And so I have a couple tools I use that sort of stop me from doing that. The first is that observation stem. So starting with frames like I noticed or I observed, right? Those help me draw to mind a specific piece of data rather than jumping ahead of the data to some sort of advice or my understanding of what might be happening. It seemed to me like blank. When X happened, I noticed you did Y, right? Sharing those observations as a starting point. And then the other tool that I think is helpful to have kind of in your back pocket are some reflective questions. So what stands out to you right now based on my observation? Why do you think that might be? Tell me more about that. Because we want our feedback interactions to be conversations rather than unidirectional like delivery of this is what I think, I'm the expert, take the advice and go. So those are some tools. And I think as you practice these, you'll find some feel more natural for you than others. Learners I work with are used to my pattern. Over time, I start with, I noticed, and then tell me more. Those are kind of my two frames because I feel like those are the most natural to me. But as you practice, try these out. It can help you stop yourself from jumping straight to advice. Now, at this point, when I deliver this talk, there are usually some people who are thinking, but wait a minute, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, I'm a developer, I have insight, I know what people should do. I have things that I want to teach them and tell them from my expertise. And that is wonderful. That is where we go in a feedback interaction. So at the center here, we share observational data. We share what we see. We share what we observe. We hold the mirror. We encourage some reflection with questions. Tell me more. What was going on? What's behind what I observed? And then from there, we use our wonderful expertise and perspective to do all kinds of different things. People might need advice. Sometimes I have learners who just say, I really have no idea what to do. What would you do? And we share that with them. You may offer a new goal for them. You may provide some mentorship or coaching, a resource that they could use. You might find that based on what you learn about the observations, that people need teaching, they need instruction, they need practice. Sometimes our learners need remediation of knowledge or skills. And so the observation frame, not jumping to advice, stops us from making inferences about what people need and allows us to find out truly what is the motivation, what is behind the actions or the behavior that we're observing, so that we can then tailor our expertise toward what that specific learner needs. So the next thing I get sort of asked when I talk about this is, there is sort of the sandwich in the room, right? So when I think about a feedback interaction, we have probably all been feedback sandwiched, which is where someone says something nice to warm you up to the conversation. Then they give you the constructive criticism right in the middle. And then we end with something nice. So you did a great job today, really hard work. You really messed up that procedure. Let me tell you why. But you worked really hard. Good job. Right? The feedback sandwich. This has been done so often that what research shows about this is that people are not listening to the pieces of bread on the feedback sandwich. People have heard this model and are anticipating it, that all they're listening for is the constructive criticism. So what this model was intended to do when it was conceptualized was really nice, that we don't want people to feel defeated by feedback. We want people to feel positively about their growth, but we've feedback sandwiched people to death. And so they only wait for the constructive criticism. And even if you give them meaningful, positive feedback on either end of the conversation, people are not listening to it. They're only listening for the middle. And so what I'm going to suggest from here are a couple different ways that you could think about structuring feedback interactions that lean into that sort of sharing observations, pausing for reflection, flow of a conversation. So one of them, this one most closely mirrors the feedback sandwich. It just restructures it a little bit. This is Pendleton's model of feedback. In this model, step one is to ask the learner what they think went well from an experience, right? So what went well for you today? Or what do you think you did well in this assignment? And then step two is to acknowledge, yes, I agree with that. Here's what I observed, what I think you did well, right? So we sort of front load the conversation with a recognition of all the things that our learners do well. And then part two of the conversation is where we lean into that constructive opportunity for growth. So again, asking the learner those reflective questions. What do you think you could improve on? What do you think you might do differently next time? And then again, we acknowledge the learner's ideas, and then we add our own observations and perspective. And then the last piece of this model is that we sort of agree with our learner about where they'll go from here. So based on our feedback conversation, what are you taking away? Or this is what I'll look for in your next assignment. So taking the concept of the feedback sandwich and just restructuring it a little bit to break from that tension that people feel when they know they're going to hear something nice and then something mean and then some other meaningless nice thing, right? So just restructuring a little bit. Another model, and this model was designed particularly for medical education, but I think has implications elsewhere, is a prepare to adapt model. So in this model, there is a pre-observation, pre-feedback interaction conversation in which the learner reflects on their goals. You as the coach or educator reflect on the program goals or your objectives for this experience, kind of setting some expectations and getting everyone on the same page. Then you go and you do the thing, you observe, you're making notes about what you see, what you experience, what you notice. And then after the observation, there's this period of that sort of reflective questioning. So asking the learner to reflect how they think things went, discussing, so sharing your observations, your modifiable specific behaviors, and the learner engages in that sort of, what I noticed this, what do you think about it? And they add their context. So really is like a back and forth interaction. And then again, here you end with kind of planning together. So our next steps based on this conversation are blank from here. So that's the prepare to adapt model. And then one other that I think is useful here is this feed forward model. So a feed forward model of feedback is future focused. It's meant to be formative in nature, so not evaluative. And I like that the feed forward model can involve peer-to-peer feedback. As educators, I think we are often stretched pretty thin when we think about giving individual feedback. And so this model brings in other learners and empowers them to be feedback deliverers as well. A couple other pros of the feed-forward model: it leverages common misconceptions. So it allows you to use your experience, right? I've taught this before, I've taught this for 5 years, I know where people get confused. It allows you to leverage that experience and expertise, and it's also efficient. So you're able to give lots of learners feedback all at the same time. So sort of an example of feed forward would be, if you are in a classroom setting with students, you may ask them to begin a writing activity. You may begin to have them start, for example, writing a differential diagnosis for a case study, an example from medical education. So begin to put your thoughts down. What is the first, differential diagnosis in this case you notice? As students are working, you circulate and you kind of make observations about what they're putting on paper, what you're seeing. You take those observations and you have everyone pause, right? Okay, everyone stop. Here's what I noticed. You make notes of common responses, errors, any knowledge gaps that you see. And then you send students back in pairs, right? So finish your differential diagnosis and then give each other feedback based on what I shared with you. So I noticed these errors. I noticed these common responses. Take a look at someone else's work and give them individualized feedback based on what I've shared. So again, empowers peer-to-peer feedback and really leverages that you don't necessarily have to be the person giving individual feedback to every learner, but that they can take your insights based on some initial observations and expand on the feedback conversation. So that sort of feed forward process where you're reflecting data back to them, you're making suggestions, and then elevating peer interactions in feed forward. So those are a couple models. And what I want to remind us about from all of the models, so sort of centering back on why we're thinking about the initiation of a feedback conversation. The first thing that all of the models do is set expectations. So helpful in normalizing feedback, right? I think people get really nervous when they hear the word feedback. I get nervous when someone says like, hey, can I give you some feedback? And so normalizing feedback is good. Feedback is normal. Feedback will happen. I'm going to give you feedback. It is part of my job. So using like the term and signposting. A lot of our faculty get very frustrated when they hear learners say like, nobody ever gives me feedback. And our faculty say, I give them feedback all the time, right? But I think that sometimes we're not signposting, right? I am going to have a feedback conversation with you in this way, at this time, and this is why. So really, really setting clear expectations, no matter kind of what model of feedback you'll be using. Those clear expectations help everyone know what's happening, when it's happening, why it's happening. Another key reminder that sort of circles back to those 7 keys to effective feedback is that when we're thinking about giving feedback that is advice-driven, that is not advice-driven, observation-driven, asking your learner, what are you working on that I can provide feedback on, really helps get your learner involved in the feedback process. If we give people feedback on things that they are passionate about, that they are working on, they're much more likely to be receptive to that feedback, rather than feedback that they sort of see as irrelevant or not a focus area for them. So asking, what are your goals? How can I support you? And then also making sure that we're sharing if we have goals that maybe aren't on their radar, but that we know are important. So here are my priorities. So I hear your goals and I will attune to those, but also you have to know that the purpose of this experience or activity is this. And so I'm also going to be giving you feedback based on what I prioritize as your educator here. So that goal setting piece really can do a lot to engage learners early in being receptive to your feedback. Another, I think, helpful reminder, and that hopefully you saw threaded through all the different examples, is that feedback, that observational data, should just be the beginning of a conversation. It's like the little sprout that starts sort of where we take a conversation. And then it's meant to be bi-directional. So our observations lead to learner reflections, which lead to education and future development, right? So that's kind of the flow. I share something, you reflect on it, we decide together kind of what we do next from here, and that it's really a learner should be an equal participant in a feedback conversation. And then the last thing to be mindful of and remember is that we should monitor ourselves for inferences. It's a natural shortcut. It saves us time. We have lots of experiences. Our brains use those to help us make decisions. But when we're giving feedback to learners, remembering that we only know our perspective. We know what we see. We know what we think might be happening, but we're missing data. We're missing the learner's piece, right? What they think, what they see, what they believe. And so monitoring for inferences by remaining curious, right? Acknowledging I don't know what they're thinking, asking questions to draw that out, like sort of opening up their minds, right? Why are they doing what they're doing? Why am I observing what I'm observing? So that you gain insight to know where to take the conversation. And again, focusing on observations helps stop us right midway through that ladder, right? I'm going to share an observation and I'm going to gain more information instead of letting my brain say, oh, well, I know that when people don't answer emails, it means that I'm not important to them. Right? That's not always true. Maybe that was true once. Maybe I learned that from someone, but it's not true in every case. And we have to stop ourselves from making those judgments and assumptions, especially when we're thinking about the education of others. We really want to focus on being a mirror for people. Because again, holding up a mirror, showing people what we observe about their performance helps them become more self-aware. I am not going to remember all of the things I did or said during this talk as one example, right? But if someone were to give me feedback to say, hey, I noticed on this slide, you gave this example, talk to me about that. Do you remember what made you come up with that, right? Helping me see my own performance and behavior empowers me to think, oh, okay, I do understand why I made that choice. And now I know to like be more intentional about that moving forward. So really holding mirror up to people. So overall, be curious. And then this can feel a little bit overwhelming at first, particularly if your nature, like mine, my nature is to go straight to advice because I want to help people. There are 3 questions that I think about for myself before I engage in a feedback conversation. So the first, I ask myself, what is the observable data I will share? What's my starting point in this conversation? What's something I noticed that I want to make sure we talk about because I think it's important? And then I think, what question will I ask to begin the conversation? Once I've answered those 2 things, it's also important for me to know upfront for myself, based on what I observed, is there advice or teaching that I want to offer this person? Like based on my experience and my expertise, where do I want the conversation to go? Do I have a direction? Do I have something important I think we need to make sure we get to? And answering those 3 things up front, doing a little bit of mental work to prepare for a feedback conversation using these questions helps me avoid kind of the pitfalls of veering into evaluation or advice. And so that's kind of the frame that I use. So that was a big overview. That was a lot. So I have a couple closing prompts for you. I'm going to ask for questions. I'm also interested in hearing what might you try, or how you're thinking about feedback might have shifted in hearing this perspective. So that's where I'll pause, because this is a lot of me talking all at once. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, or call them out, or respond to either of those prompts.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this. Very useful, many tips. I had never really thought about the distinction between advice and feedback, and it's quite helpful to have it defined quite clearly where the differences are. Now, I think you use quite helpful examples to do so. I have opened the floor for questions and comments, so people can either go ahead and post them in the chat, but you can also just raise your hand. So if you unshare your screen, then we can probably see people on the screen here. Yeah, great. And yeah, feel free to turn on your camera as well if you like. That's absolutely fine. Is there any question from the audience? Emily.
Hello, thank you very much. And I now realize I give a lot of advice.
Me too.
My question is, and this will not be the first time we've had this question. Obviously, like the entire point is that it's a dialogue, and it's a back and forth, and I can absolutely see how this applies to verbal interactions with students. How do you have any advice on how you can apply this in writing?
Yes, I do get that question a lot. This is the sort of bi-directional nature makes it very hard to do this in writing, but I do think drawing students' attention to specific elements, things you notice, and asking questions like in your comments there. So I notice here, this was your approach, or this was your response. Remember, we talked about X in class, and seeing if that prompts some like reflection, rather than just going straight to telling people what to change or telling them what's wrong. But it is much harder to do this in a unidirectional way. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have one question in the chat by Kirsty. Do you have any guidance for when asking students to identify their goals, what they might want feedback on, as in guidance for the students? As sometimes this really stumps them when asked.
Yes, the like, what do you want feedback on today? And you get like the blank stare, right? What you're the teacher, whatever you think. I think using that as a learning opportunity to help them say, well, this is kind of the topic. This is kind of what we're working on, big picture. So as you think about yourself, what do you want me to notice? And really, for students who are super stuck, I see that a lot with our really novice learners, giving them a little bit of insight. Like, at this phase in your development, an appropriate goal might be this, from my experience. So giving them a little bit of support in learning how to goal set and think about their own development is sometimes useful. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat, but I think I have the same issue. Sorry, that was me that asked the question.
Yes.
I thought I will unmute. I will be brave. I'll even show my face. But yes, so it's a fair point of having that conversation in person. But I know certainly my brain goes to formative assessments and trying to get students to kind of critically evaluate. And then they have like that problem of like, if I ask them, what do you want feedback on? And they would say, if they had to write something, they'd be like, I want to know how to get a good mark. And so that's where I like the idea of like building, like having some sort of guidance of, here are some examples, what things make you nervous. But I am once again very much thinking about feedback more in the setting of the written feedback, as opposed to say in labs or something, where having these kind of conversations over several days where you can have that development over time, but having something written which people like the students can go back to over time, and the benefit of that, as opposed to something that gets said and then the student doesn't write it down, and then the end of like a 9-to-5 lab and they're like, Kirsty said something that revolutionized my life and I can't remember what it is. So yeah, it was just if you knew of any like written guidance or anything that was published that could be useful to start building something like that, because I definitely want to have a try with this for like formatives.
Yeah, I think that people lean a lot into rubrics, specifically like very well-defined like criteria based on what the goals are of the assignment or the approach or the whatever you have students working on, because specific rubrics can then give students insight and specific feedback on like different elements of their work. So that's one tool I see used as a means of like having an anchor that people can kind of refer back to. Rubrics are also helpful in helping people goal set, because over time you can see like kind of where the feedback is less strong or where their performance is a little bit less up to the competency that you're looking for. So that's one approach. And I see some people are responding in the chat. If you also, anyone else have insights to this question, please feel free to add them.
Yeah, I think the rubric point is quite it's interesting because we use rubrics in level 2 psychology for students, and we use it not only as a way to evaluate their report, but also we have them interact with the rubric in advance. So before submitting their report, we give them the rubric, and we have them in an activity during the lab. We have them self-evaluate where they think their report is at the moment, probably a week before submission. So how much they have mastered each part of the rubric. And it's quite interesting to see that they have a very good self-reflection, actually, on the more difficult and less difficult learning outcomes in the rubric. So you can really match the rubric of their self-reflection to the actual evaluation later on when they have the feedback is returned. So we see that.
That's a really great way to build that self-awareness skill too, right? How closely does my self-perception reflect the lens of my teacher or the expert?
Yeah. We have another, we had another question in the chat. I'm interested by Samantha. I'm interested to know if there's evidence which supports approaching feedback in this way improves psychological safety in students.
Yes, there are some references. I would be happy to send them that connect this sort of feedback frame to psychological safety. Some of the concerns that we see in the literature and with students around feedback is that there's a fear of judgment, there's a fear of unfair criticism, that sort of ladder of inference confirmation bias can lead to students not trusting the feedback, not feeling safe. And so this opening that invites students to share their perspective does a lot to kind of lower the defenses that students see. So thank you for that question, Samantha.
We have another question from Julie. She raised her hand.
Hi, hello. Apologies, I don't have a camera, so I can't switch it on. I'm very sorry about that. Thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk with really, really enlightening, and the chat has also been really interesting. One really interesting way that I see myself using this difference between feedback and advice is, have you tried using feedback type questions in things that happen that happen asynchronously? For example, if students have an assignment to complete at home, I was thinking, could this be used to add self-reflection questions that are better targeted at the end? Because sometimes we try to use self-reflection questions, but students see those as an interference and as a waste of time, and they're trying to go over like, what exactly do you want me to put in this self-reflective question? I'll give it to you, we'll call it quits, and we can move on with our day. So it might make it more authentic.
Yes. Self-reflective questions paired with assignments, I think, is a really useful tool when you can convince students that they're actually meaningful. And I think a way to do that is sort of conditioning them to know that when they're doing an assignment and then you're asking them, how did you approach this? What was challenging for you? Do a little bit of reflection with the assignment submission. I think, and using that as you frame your feedback on the assignment, right? I see that you felt like this part was really challenging. I took a look at it and actually here's a strength. But really like including elements of that reflection that you're asking them for in how you frame your feedback on the assignment is one way to sort of make the connection that this is meaningful and it's information that otherwise I wouldn't have about what you were thinking while you did the assignment. So that's one approach that I've seen be useful in sort of getting students past the like, well, this is a waste of time. You know, why are you making me reflect? But really that it adds insight into what you were thinking while you did the thing.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think there was a comment by Louise, also fabulous idea here. She co-creates with her year 3 group coursework rubrics with students. And that gives students ownership as well. I think that's also a very good approach, actually.
I love that.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? I'm going to use the time to share this resource with you, just the upcoming talks, and as well, this talk and all the others are recorded, and you find everything here as well under those links with additional resources.
If you don't mind, I'm going to share one more slide because in the
Yes.
spirit of talking about feedback, I'm going to ask you for some feedback. So I have one slide, there's a QR code on here. I'll just share it for a second. If you wouldn't mind, if you have a few seconds, I think it's just 3 questions. If you wouldn't mind scanning that and giving me a little feedback so that I can make this talk better for future audiences, I would really appreciate it.
And you're looking for feedback, not advice, right?
I will take both, actually, from this group. I will take feedback and or advice.
Oh, we have another question actually here from Joanna. She asks, how do you remember to stay out of advice mode?
It's so hard. My nature is to go straight to advice. That is why I have picked those 2 frames. And like so much so that my students make fun of me about it is that I noticed, tell me more. And I make sure that that is the first words out of my mouth. And then I stop talking because my tendency is to go right for it. So I would say if you can anchor on even just one reflective question or something that is the first words out of your mouth is a step for helping those of us who are advice givers. Anyone else have thoughts?
I know, I think that was, yeah, that's actually a very good concrete suggestion to go into conversations like this, or also start or have this in your mind when you're giving, for example, written feedback as well. So this is your initial thought process that then captures how you give feedback. I think that's quite helpful.
And the other thing I'll say too is that this is hard for me to do, but also a lot of my learners push me. Like, I just want your advice, right? Just tell me what you think I should do. And so you have to learn, like, there's the pushback to myself, don't do it. And there's the pushback sometimes to learners. Like, no, I'm not going to tell you what I think you should do yet or now, right? I want you to reflect. I want you to think about it. I want us to like talk about it together is important in building that skill too. Because sometimes they push hard. Like, no, I don't want to do the reflection thing. Just tell me. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you guys so much. This has
Thank
been...
you so much. I think, yeah, so everyone is really happy and positive feedback so far on your talk. So Rachel, thank you very much for your talk, for giving lots of food for thought. I hope to see you all at the next Tile Network seminar, and I will put together a summary and the recording, everything in a post on our Tile Network website as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.